Hello and welcome to Pain Unfiltered, where we go in-depth into the interventional pain and spine world with some of the top key opinion leaders and executives in the space. We are your hosts, Dr. Patrick Buchanan and Dr. Timothy Deere for this Aspen podcast. Let's get started. Welcome to the Pain Unfiltered podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Patrick Buchanan, and with me is my co-host, Dr. Timothy Deere. Tim, we've just surpassed 20,000 downloads for the podcast. How are you feeling about that?
You know, Patrick, I feel like, we have a community and we have a family in Aspen. And I think that goes to show that we want to hear what each other is saying. And I really think it's a compliment to you and what you've done. This was your vision. I'm so honored to be on the ride with you, Patrick. And I think you're a great young leader. So I think that's a tribute to you. It shows us that we're not done yet. We got to do a better job to even get that even higher and bring more people on board. And I know you can do that. And I think today with the two great guests we have today is an example of the type of people you're choosing to be on this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it, Tim. You know, this is just the beginning for us. You know, obviously I couldn't do this without you and your support, and obviously you bringing in some of these guests and speakers as well with your notoriety. And obviously appreciate the listeners and the sponsors as well. You know, we've had some phenomenal sponsors this season. Specifically, we've had Saluda Medical, Mainstay Medical, as we're going to talk about today, Spinal Simplicity. Speaking of great companies, today we're discussing Mainstay Medical's journey to commercialization. We're excited to be joined by Jason Hannon, CEO of Mainstay Medical, and Dr. Kiran Patel, Director of Pain Medicine at Lenox Hill Hospital. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Great. So Jason, we'll start with you. Let's start from the very beginning. You had, this original idea. What was behind the original hypothesis of the reactivate therapy, and why did you believe that the team that you have kind of configured could execute this?
So the original idea was extremely simple. It was the reality that mechanical low back pain, the worst diagnosis a patient can get, non-specific chronic axial low back pain. It's a diagnosis that means nothing. And so it was originally research into that in the physiatry literature, seeing an MRI with fat growing into the multifidus, infiltrating all through it. And it was simply a correlation between fat in the MRI and back pain, long-term chronic back pain. And it was a simple question, which was, is a cause, is a correlation? What's going on here? We obviously figured out through research, there's more than a correlation there. We can now prove it. But ultimately, that was the genesis, was let's see if we can use neurostimulation to overcome whatever's not happening that's allowing fat to grow into that muscle, and then it can't perform its function. And if we can fix it, maybe we do good things. It was that simple in the early days when Danny Sachs, our founder, put those two things together.
Now, Jason, I think that's really fantastic. And then you went to some early studies that, you developed in the European community, I think, originally. And then, as we talk more about this, and you mentioned this fatty infiltration of the multifidus, I think the fact that you found this biomarker along the way is really amazing to me. So what's the importance of being able to recognize that on imaging for patient selection when you think about the origin to where you are today?
Yeah, it's one thing to say, we sometimes use the knee as a corollary. We all see the quadricep will atrophy substantially with a meniscal tear or an ACL tear. You can conceptualize that in your head. It's not a biomarker, though. You don't see that when it's inside someone's low back, particularly given the multifidus is about as deeply embedded next to your spine as you can be. So the question was, is what we're seeing on MRI a genuine biomarker? And what you see, and a great researcher in Australia named Paul Hodges has done a ton of research to figure out when acute low back pain becomes chronic. And it becomes chronic when you can start to see fat infiltrating into the muscle. It happens between months 6 and 12. And so when you see that, there's no neural drive from the central nervous system down to the muscle to get it to fire. It's hugely significant when you're seeing that fat, as the biomarker is telling you, your brain's not causing the muscle to fire in advance of movement. That's the critical thing to understand with that muscle. It fires before you move to stabilize your spine. And if you're full of fat in your multifidus, that process is not happening. So your segments are shifting over each other in your lumbar spine, causing pain. It's critical for that process.
Yeah, I think you just mentioned it, Jason. These multifidus atrophy is one of those aha moments when you kind of contribute that to low back pain, kind of like modic changes for basovertebral nerve ablation. We had Ray Baker on to talk about that too, and commercializing that as well, and getting your own diagnosis codes and payer coverage. Let me give you one more question, and then we'll turn to Kiran regarding the studies and the data about this. For those of our listeners that may not understand the complexity of payer landscape in the U.S., how challenging was this to get commercial payer coverage for such an innovative medical device as Reactivate?
There's no more, I would say, more complicated, but the truth is no worse pathway you can follow in the U.S. than to try and bring a novel medical device to market. I mean, we had to run a clinical study no different than you would for a pacemaker. We needed multiple clinical studies. We like to say this is about a 17-year research project at this point. The truth is it's a 17-year payer coverage project up to this point, because everything leads up to that point. And uniquely, when our patients who are most affected by this are somewhere between 30 and 75. I mean, it's a huge age range of patients. Ultimately, you need access for private insurance. And every private insurance company in the United States makes their own decisions about every single thing they pay for. So you can address Medicare at one level, and you may get Anthem to write a coverage policy. It doesn't mean United is going to do the same thing, or Aetna, or Cigna, or Humana. You could go on and on. You have to sit in front of every single insurance company and answer every question they can possibly have, clinically, scientifically, financially. It is a long process, and we are by no means done.
Jason, I've sat in front of a lot of those companies, and that can be quite a ordeal sometimes. But at the end of the day, we have to do it. So, Kiran, years ago, I met with Peter Crosby, who was in the CEO position long before Jason was, and we talked a little bit about the pathway, and I want to get to the study here in a moment. But I think a lot of companies really are hurt when they get to go 510K. And they get approval and they get paid, and they have no research at all, and no data to support themselves. And so Jason and I were just at an ortho spine conference, and there's no data to present when there's a 510K with no study. So as you know, the data here for this therapy is really fantastic. 5-year data. Kiran, give us a little background on the study, the design. Why is it so important? Why is it one of the best studies ever done in the space?
So I think what you're referring to is the Reactivate B study, which is for which, we have 5-year data, which in our field is unprecedented. And so, the fact that that it was sham controlled, and that these patients were followed out to 5 years is astounding. We don't have many sham controlled studies within our field. And then, the types of results that we see in the Reactivate B study are clearly mimicked in the same results that we see with the most recent publication of the Restore study. And so the Restore study, I think, is really the one that, and I'd love to get Jason's thoughts on this, as he's been having these conversations with more and more payers, but it seems to be the one that has really moved the needle and is really allowing us to start to see more commercial coverage. So the Restore study is the most recent publication, and it was a prospective randomized controlled multi-center study. It was 25 clinical sites, 203 patients, and they were randomized 1-to-1 to reactivate and optimize medical management. And on average, these patients, about 47 years old, and on average had been in back pain for about 11 years. And what's really exciting is that the crossover arm of the patients are going to be followed out to 2 years. Again, demonstrating kind of the commitment of Mainstay and really the nature of this therapy, where we want to look at long-term outcomes because we are treating a chronic condition. And so the difference here is that for this study, the primary outcome was, really Oswestry Disability Index. And so whereas many of the studies and most of the studies in our space, the primary outcome is, NRS or VAS score, the primary outcome for the Restore study was Oswestry Disability Index. And what was found is that there was nearly a 20-point change in ODI for the patients who received the treatment arm of restorative neuromodulation or restorative neurostimulation, Reactivate. And as you guys all know, a 20-point change in ODI is life changing for somebody who's severely disabled or crippling disability level. So I think that really is kind of the high level importance of what the Restore study has demonstrated. And similarly, it wasn't just the ODI. We also saw statistically significant improvements, obviously in NRS and the EQ5D. And going back to what I initially said in terms of the comparison with the similarities to the Reactivate B study, we see that these patients, their NRS scores in the Restore trial went from 7.1 to 3.6, and in the Reactivate B at 1 year, they went from 7.3 to 3. Similarly, ODI went from 44 to 24 and 39 to 19. I mean, the outcomes are so similar that it's overwhelming because it just kind of goes to show that patients who have multifidus dysfunction and may have a variety of other coexisting pathologies, if they are using this therapy, we have a very predictable way in which they may respond. And what was really exciting, I think, about Restore is that when we look at back pain remitters, right, we talk about an NRS score of less than 3 at 1 year. We saw this in 52% of the patients in the Reactivate B and only 6% in the optimized medical management. And I think that says a lot. And we've seen a very similar outcome in the Reactivate B study at 1 year. So the fact that we could say to a patient, hey, if you have multifidus dysfunction and you may have any of these other coexisting pathologies, there's a 52% chance that at 1 year you might be a low back pain remitter. That's a statistic that we haven't been able to really bring to patients with a great deal of confidence. So I think that's exciting. And then just looking at the design of this study, what is optimal medical management, right? It's such a mosaic, right? So how I practice in New York and how you practice in West Virginia is dictated by a lot of things. One, what our patients are willing to do, what their local insurance coverage will allow, potentially the socioeconomics of the area. So across the country, there is a mosaic of optimized medical management. And how it was defined in this study was a combination of physical therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, chiropractic manipulations, and spinal interventions, basic spinal interventions, which is kind of what exists right now. So it varies from all around the country, but that was controlled for that optimized medical management.
I just want to butt in for a second and ask you a question about what you just said. I mean, a great description. I think both the original study that led to approval and the Restore study have been so important, but you said the average age was about 47, which I think I love that because we have so many of those patients who have trouble getting approval for any therapy because they're not in the Medicare population, they're younger population. So as we think about what the Restore study means in the real world setting, we have a lot of those people come to see us every day in both New York and California and West Virginia. What was that patient like in the Restore study? There were 47, but were they inactive? Were they people who had inability to function? And then you talk about the ODI. Where did they go from to where did they come to? Where was what was the difference? I know it's 20 points, but you explain to what someone in private practice in Peoria.
Yeah, and I think it runs a gamut, right? You have patients who have the desire to be super active, right? And then you have those who haven't been active in years and are astounded by the types of activities that they can now perform. I often hear with patients that I treat, I'm doing things now that I haven't done in 5-10 years. And I think this is really exciting because if we're able to intervene at a younger age, which sometimes means, motivated to do more activity and hopefully certainly does for the most part, it allows us to look at, disease progression and say, wow, we can really decrease the chronicity of lower back pain by intervening potentially earlier in the treatment algorithm. And I think that's really astounding. I think as opposed to being pain practitioners where interventional pain, providers where people come to us and they say, hey, well, I have back pain now, and we're looking at, right now, right here, how to treat their pain. We need to look at the long term, right? We need to look at 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. And I think this data is really something that draws attention to that and how we can really, provide a disease-modifying therapy.
Yeah, those outcomes are great clinically. Let's talk about how that translates to payers now. We'll turn it back over to you, Jason. Can you walk us through how commercial payers like Anthem evaluate new technologies and what criteria they're looking for?
So there are published lists of what payers look for in the U.S. I wouldn't say it's as uniform as a published list makes it sound, but the buckets of what's needed, randomized clinical trials, and more than one. So, word to the wise for any other new therapies coming. It's hard. Invest the money and invest the time. Run the randomized studies that the payers want to see. Otherwise, you're just going to keep arguing. Randomized studies, real world confirmations. You got to run real world studies to say we're getting the same results in the real world that we get in our clinical studies, because every payer is going to suggest that, of course, you get great results in those randomized clinical trials. They're highly controlled. Can you get the same results in the real world? Can you explain your mechanism scientifically? Actually be able to explain it. Well, when we started here, this was a hypothesis, 10 or 15 years ago, and we called it that openly. A hypothesized mechanism of action is, and we now have published studies that objectively demonstrate what it is. So we can answer the scientific question. And then it's cost. And at some point, I do think that payers are sincere in that they often get accused of they won't pay for anything unless it saves them a ton of money. I don't think that's true. I think they really do look at clinical data. They're just extremely skeptical about clinical data. They're extremely skeptical about pain scores, subjective patient-delivered or patient-reported pain scores. That's why we did ODI, as Dr. Patel mentioned, as the primary outcome. But cost matters. Are you at least obviating the need for other therapies that would typically be delivered? And we can argue a single injection is not that expensive, but patients don't get a single injection. And are you obviating the need for those? You have to prove all of that to payers, even to get their attention. For us to go from 18 months ago, when I would present, 5 medical directors, cameras off. That's what it was 18 months ago. Thank you very much. Click, right, end of the meeting, to where we are today, which is true MDs on the call, the medical directors making the decisions on the call, cameras on, questions being asked, engagement is there, understanding. Unless you knock down all those barriers, it's cameras off in a relatively short meeting at that point.
So, Jason, I have kind of a two-part question, one for you and one for Dr. Patel here about those issues. So, you had to go raise a round of funding to, and I've been part of those many a time, and you and I've had these discussions, and you had to go convince an investor to spend the money on this RESTORE study. After you actually came on board from, I think, the spine world, and you took the previous studies and you explained those very well using people like Chris Gilligan and others and Dr. Patel to help you explain those. But now you want to invest another pile of money in a big RCT. And so, number one, how do you decide to do that? The part two of the question is for Dr. Patel, and that is, Kiran, how do you decide to work with a company? And you obviously chose to work with Mainstay and the Reactivate device. And so I want to tie those two things together. How do you talk to investors? Because we have a lot of people in the industry who watch this or listen to this podcast. And then how did Dr. Patel choose to work with someone like you, and why did she choose to work with Mainstay?
So part one of that, I came on board in the second half of the original RCT and then managed the FDA process for FDA approval. Within hours of getting FDA approval, set the board down. Our board was investors, all investors at the time, and said, "Great, we got FDA approval. Let's start a second study right away." And you can imagine the reception, the cold thud in the room of reception of, "Wait, you want to spend how many tens of millions of dollars again?" It is, for me, and I think for anyone who looks at it this way, it's all about your time horizon. If you're trying to create something valuable and sell it, you don't go run a second RCT. If you genuinely believe you have a foundational therapy that can become standard of care, then you're doing it a disservice if you do anything but run another big study, because you may get limited access. You're not going to get private payers. And so it wasn't easy at the time to raise that kind of money. We've been fortunate to have great investors backing us, but essentially it was time horizon. How far are you looking out? We're looking out a long way.
Kiran, we'll turn it to you of why you decided to partner with Mainstay
Sure.
and
So,
why you believe in
in addition to my
therapies.
role as the director of pain at Lennox, I'm a program director for 4 pain medicine fellows every year with Hofstra Northwell. And I'm often asked this question, when I teach my own fellows and others, how do you decide what therapies to bring into your practice, and how do you decide what therapies to, leave at the door? And I think it comes down to some basic principles. And I say the first thing is, one, does it physiologically make sense? And so when I was presented with the concept of multifidus neurostimulation or restorative neurostimulation, it made sense how it could potentially help. And then the next step, I think, number 2, is to look at the IDE data and look at the quality of studies that have contributed to that and formed that body of evidence. And then what were those results, right? And really try to pick those studies apart. And if it passes that, then look at the real world studies and do the real world studies match up to the IDE? And for Mainstay, looking at, Reactivate A and Reactivate B, and then looking at, a bunch of post-market studies that have been done both in the US and Europe, finding that, those results completely lined up from both NRS score and from an ODI improvement. And then seeing in my own practice, right? I think that's the 4th bit. When you bring the therapy into your own practice, do your outcomes match up to what you see in the IDE and the real world data? And that is certainly what I've seen. And so as I've treated more patients and, as an interventional pain physician, to be able to really, truly improve patients' function, this therapy to me, has really allowed patients to do more in a way that I haven't seen with many other therapies. And so all of that taken together is really kind of why I have, chosen to offer this therapy to my patients.
I love what you said about, seeing it in your practice. I think that's so critical because, I've been involved in RCTs before. And then when they get approval, the same exact thing I was involved in RCT, I haven't seen the same results in my own practice. So it's really a great point you make. I think that should be a measure for everything we do. So, Jason, let me ask you a question about the future. So if you think back, a few months ago, someone was cleaning out an office here locally, and they found an old programmer that me and my old PA, Doug Stewart, used to use for a stimulator from the 1990s. And it was the size of a table. It was this huge programmer thing, right? And we used that big programmer to go negative positive or positive negative. That's about all we could do. We had 4 contacts on our lead. And it was either a bipole, you switch the bipole around. But that was like the modern technology then, okay? And it was like, we thought it was pretty cool. Now, having said that, today we did a big revision of a device and it really evolved. So I bring that up to say it's 2025. We've got great partners like Dr. Patel. You've done a great job, but you can't rest on your laurels, right? Where's the future of this therapy? Where's the future of this company? I know you have some ideas. So where do you think you're going?
So I would say this. You made the comment early about the requirement to go through a full IDE. Right? So we went through the PMA pathway, the FDA. It's the longest regulatory pathway. It's the longest reimbursement pathway when you do something like this. And you feel like I felt every day for the last 8 years since I've been here. You just can't innovate. Your hands are tied all day long. You can't change the device. Right? Our device is relatively old, the actual the IPG itself. You can't change the device. You can't change the clinical protocol. You can't change patient selection. All of that is bound in by regulatory. And you fight all these battles and you do all these studies to go get reimbursement. And now you're going to get a coverage policy, but you can't change anything because you got to live within the coverage policy. We are literally right now living through the transition from handcuffs to freedom. I don't know another way to say it. Like all of a sudden, we have all the clinical data. It's the most studied device of its kind. We have an understanding FDA of what the therapy finally does. Payers all of a sudden finally are realizing and fully educated it's not a spinal cord stimulator, a different patient. What is restorative neurostimulation? They've all 90+% of all payers in the country have created restorative neurostimulation as a category. So the handcuffs are coming off on what we can do with the therapy. Um, we have built a new device that you all will see soon. That will take us, I would say, more than to the current age, slightly into the future, which would be great for everyone. The patients um, will like the device better. It'll be a heck of a lot smaller. It'll communicate better. A lot of real-time feedback. You don't need our sales or clinical person in the room all the time to interrogate the device. A lot of advancements on that front. We have multiple studies going on in slightly advanced indications with the therapy, so you can expand who you can use the therapy on. We will be dogged about prove it in a study first before you market it for that purpose, but this is the value of a clinically and scientifically based company. We're going to keep running these studies, and we're going to pick the brains of all of our clinician partners on which patient do you see that you can't help. You think we could use Reactivate for that? Let's run a study together. I would say the device, clarity on indications as we expand them going forward, communication with the device, which translates to ease on your team of managing these patients ongoing and not quite the burden that we used to have. And then lots of other things, but I'm going to keep them secret for now.
Fantastic answer, Patrick.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Jason. You kind of briefly mentioned this, but we'll talk a little bit further about the Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield breakthrough, because I think this is a game changer in payer coverage, and those 47-year-old patients that were in their study, would definitely qualify for this. Can you just share the details specifically around that Anthem coverage policy?
So Anthem is the largest payer in the U.S. thus far to write a specific Reactivate coverage policy. It's specific to Reactivate as a therapy, not a class of therapies. As Dr. Patel mentioned, and she was a lead on the Restore study. The Restore study is clearly the model that Anthem used for its coverage policy. The inclusion criteria for the Anthem coverage policy is the inclusion criteria from the Restore study. So again, for any of your listeners, do we really need to run a second RCT? I think the Anthem process for us proved how valuable it was because they took the inclusion list straight from that study. Would we love the inclusion list to be even simpler? Sure, we can run another study and make it simpler, and it proves there's a model for doing that. It's huge. You do not know when you're meeting with all these payers who's going to be the first one to write a coverage policy. You don't know if anyone's going to be the first one, and they don't call you in advance and tell you what's coming. Anthem is a serious research-oriented group. They did their own research. They heard from Dr. Patel and others, and they wrote the coverage policy. There's 30 million plus covered lives in Anthem alone. And so many of our existing physician implanters are in places where there's lots of patients who have Anthem insurance. That's great for them. It gives us a chance to expand. And the Anthem population is exactly the patients who are in the Restore study. So it's huge for us. I think it's great for the interventional space overall to see a payer take notice of something like this. Hopefully it's a model for others to follow, and hopefully they will.
Jason, great job. I'm so impressed. And I think it goes back to the hard work of your team, but also goes back to asked Dr. why she chose you, but it goes to show the importance of who you choose to work with, to do a great job clinically as in the research process. So Kiran, I'm going to ask a follow-up question of you on this, on the Restore study and what it means for payers. So we see this Anthem drop, here of approval, which I think was huge and shows all the hard work all of you did. And thank you for that, because I think all of our patients appreciate that. But now, what I've seen in the past, there's scrutiny going forward. We're bringing more spine surgeons in to do this therapy, which I think is fantastic. And we talk about maybe at the end of the podcast here on that issue. How do we make sure that our colleagues around the country, the Aspen members listening to this podcast, how can we assure they get the same outcomes that you got in Restore? What's your advice to the listeners here, the physician listeners?
I think that's an excellent question. And it's really important to take note of the fact that the Anthem coverage policy is carved out of really the inclusion criteria from the Restore study, right? And so I think it starts with that my advice to my colleagues out there is to start looking at the patient population that most closely mimics the clinical trials that have demonstrated this high level of evidence that there's improvements in both ODI and NRS. So I think start with patient selection, stick with things that are on label. Look for patients who have multifidus dysfunction, who have the clinical cues, who have multifidus atrophy on MRI, who are not clearly candidates for structural surgical intervention, and go from there. And in terms of implementing the therapy, make sure you have access to appropriate training. And our partners at Mainstay Medical can make sure that if there are physicians out there who are interested in getting training, that they are trained appropriately, and that they are also, that's followed up with close mentorship with other physicians who are currently implementing the therapy. I'm constantly speaking to different physicians in my area who are just now starting to implement Reactivate, and happy to get on calls or to go to smaller training labs with them. So our partners at Mainstay Medical can help with the kind of the hands-on aspect of it, but the most important thing is the proper patient selection. And I think those two together are really going to lend itself to great outcomes that mimic what we've seen in the body of evidence.
Thanks, Kiran. That's a great explanation for patient selection. I just got one more follow-up question for you, and then we can kind of go into our closing thoughts. How does Reactivate, go into your treatment algorithm? Are you doing epidurals, medial branch blocks, RFAs first? Are you referring to a surgeon?
It's interesting. The more patients you treat with Reactivate, you realize that we need to do more to steer patients' course of the chronicity of their lower back pain. Patients often come to us, and some of them are in a lot of distress when they arrive to our offices, and we focus on shorter term therapies. That's kind of our go-to, right? We have to start with simple interventions and then move to quote unquote more advanced things. However, if we look at the patient's history, right? We look at the studies. We just talked about Restore. These patients on average were in pain for 11 years. So if a patient has been in pain for 11 years, starting with an intervention that we know at best will have a short-term outcome, it's a little short-sighted. And so more and more, I'm starting to look at my patients as, we need to not look at how you feel in 4 weeks and how you feel in maybe 3 months. We need to look at how are you going to be in 1 year? What's your functionality going to be in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years, right? So this is truly a disease-modifying therapy that I have started to introduce much earlier in the algorithm, because some of the patients, if you sit down with them and you really talk to them, they've been in pain for a while and they've tried all of these simple things, and they've kind of gone through the, I get a simple intervention, I go to physical therapy. They're in this mill of chronic back pain, and this is an opportunity to really kind of break that cycle. And I encourage all of the physicians out there to think about introducing it earlier in the algorithm when they identify the proper patient.
I can add one note on that, because this is by far my favorite conversation with physicians who implant, reactivate, treat patients, is this debate over, if I identify a pain generator, do I treat the pain generator, or do I look to treat an underlying cause like multifidus dysfunction? And which do I do first? Because I may have to do both. We all know that over time. Just from a pure data perspective, the data in our studies shows the average patient treated with Reactivate in the study has at least 3 clear comorbid pain-generating conditions: advanced disc degeneration, facet issues, modic changes. It could be any of these things. And so what we're learning is, and this is what we see from those who implant Reactivate regularly, typically you'll see someone treat a pain generator, and then if there's still issues longer term, maybe Reactivate is used. The longer people use Reactivate, like Dr. Patel is describing, that algorithm tends to flip. Let's see if we can treat the underlying cause, because our data says there's a pretty good chance you may not need to treat any of those individual pain generators. And that's to the individual clinician, but at least we know the therapy is starting to drive.
What I would add to that is that a lot of times when we think we're treating the underlying pain generator, sometimes we're temporizing. And I think there's a distinction between treating the pain generator versus temporizing.
No, those are all great comments, and from my experience personally as well, I'm being more aggressive too. incorporate and reactivate up my algorithm, just seeing the great results I'm having with my patients too. So those are all great points. It's backed by data, and now it's getting commercial payers to get involved as well. So again, thank you guys so much for joining us today. I think this has been really educational for our listeners out there. Tim, we'll start with you with your final thoughts and then go to Jason and Kiran.
Yeah, no, I think what a great discussion. I think there's so many final thoughts, Patrick, we could go to. One is, I think that therapies evolve. And going back to my time in Ireland, meeting with CEO years ago, before Jason's time, I heard the explanations, and it's been clarified over time based on research, based on basic science work, based on anatomy work, based on studies. So I think the evolution of this therapy has been really fun to watch, and I know what's coming down the pipeline with Jason, and I think the pipeline's even more exciting. So to me, this is a great success story of really taking a hypothesis to the clinic and then to success. Also, I was just in Cabo with Jason. Hannon was there with me in a meeting called the State of the Spine, Ortho Spine meeting. And what I found was ortho spine surgeons are getting this, and they want to offer this therapy. So we're starting to see that collaboration and that merging of thoughts between ourselves, interventional spine physicians like all of us, and the ortho spine population, neurosurgery population. I think that's when a therapy can do that, when it can bridge that gap. I think to me that's a great therapy. So I find that extremely encouraging. The real data collection we've seen so far has been matching the studies, and I love what Kiran said about making sure they meet that's how when you explain it to a patient, they meet. So that's great. And then lastly, I think it goes to show you leadership matters. I think Jason's leadership and his team has really mattered to the success, and I think KOLs matter. Who you choose to work with and do your studies really matter. And this is a great example of both of those things. So to me, this has been very enjoyable to listen to today in this discussion, but it's been enjoyable. I've been watching this thing for many years. So to watch this become successful now and help a lot of patients worldwide warms my heart. And I think it goes to a lot of hard work by a lot of people. So congratulations. That's my final thought of this podcast. And I'll give it back to you, Patrick, to go through the other thoughts.
Yeah, we'll just turn it to Jason real quick for his final thoughts, and then Kiran, and then I'll wrap it up.
Great. Well, thanks to you guys for the time and attention. This is my final thought would be this: a almost 2-decade research effort to demonstrate that this thing is real, that the mechanism of action is real, and that we can treat it. You can go back 50, 60 years in the physiatry literature and see the underlying issue we're talking about. But as we all know, in the real world, if there's no therapeutic, the diagnostic is of questionable value. We've now married these things together with a clear biomarker. And as Dr. Deere says, there's a really nice collaboration building between spine and the interventional world. And as we know, most of these devices are implanted by interventional pain physicians today. In different communities, patients flow to different places. We're seeing a synergy. There's no turf war around Reactivate. And I think that's a really neat thing to see. The research will continue. And we're excited to see the patient outcomes, as Dr. Patel said, in the real world. Like I've been in spine and pain my entire career. I've never seen these types of outcomes. Like what's possible with this therapy is just not possible with other therapies. It doesn't mean every patient's going to get an incredible home run outcome. But when you see what these patients and how they can recover, you just don't have a 15-year chronic pain patient on opioids dealing with their pain who runs a marathon 2 years after getting implanted. Like that doesn't happen with other therapies. It's heartwarming to see. I love it. There's obviously a business side of this, but we will bring this therapy to your practice. It will be us who does it. We'll support the heck out of you. Excited for the future.
Sure. It's interesting that we
Kiran,
talk about how, we're starting to see surgeons kind of come along with see eye to eye with interventional pain regarding this therapy. As Jason knows, I actually implanted. There was a orthopedic surgeon who came from Las Vegas to New York City to have me do his implant. And that was about 6 months ago. And he says that now, since having the device, he's able to operate, whereas he would struggle through 3-hour cases. He's easily doing them, and he's not, paying for it afterward. And so, he's motivated and he just recently got trained and is very excited to offer the therapy to his patients. So I think my advice to physicians out there who are listening and young physicians who are out there listening is to always follow the evidence, right? So that body of evidence for restorative neurostimulation is astounding. And it's, we have 5-year sham controlled data. We have data that is, multi-center randomized prospective control to optimize medical management with an endpoint of an ODI. These are things that we haven't had for other therapies in our space. And I think it really allows us to kind of shift the game from looking at short-term impact to a longer-term impact with a truly disease-modifying therapy. And I think if you follow the evidence, meaning starting with patients who mimic the selection criteria for these studies, and you implement the therapy just as it was implemented in these studies, you're going to have great outcomes. And that is certainly what I'm finding.
I just want to echo Tim's comments again. Thank you guys for joining us, Jason, with your leadership and getting this through. It's an exciting time to be in our field. There's a lot of medical device companies out there trying to do the same thing you. And I think you've provided a fantastic blueprint on how you get this started and how you get the clinical study started and how you get this through the payer mix. So thank you for doing this. It's a true success story. And being able to have this for our patients is awesome. And Kiran, with you, thank you for spearheading these studies and talking to these payers directly and really pushing this through the finish line as well with coverage expansion. And hopefully we get more of these payers to start buying in with not only this therapy, but other therapies as well. So appreciate you coming on. And this wraps up the Pain Unfiltered podcast. Thank you guys for all joining us.